After the Civil War and the initial hope of a true racial awakening during Reconstruction, the country soon settled into Jim Crowism. By the 1890s, Black Americans were deemed second-class citizens, if that, in many areas of the country and in all walks of life, including baseball. But there were areas of the country where a good ball player was a good ball player, regardless of the color of his skin. Kewanee, Illinois, founded by abolitionists, was one of those areas. When Lou Reynolds arrived in Kewanee with his extraordinary baseball skills, he found acceptance and respect in the city. When he died nearly 50 years later, he was the acknowledged grand old man of baseball, Kewanee's Mr. Baseball. Before we explore Lou's life, let's first take a quick look at baseball, Black Americans, and Kewanee before Lou's arrival on the scene. Baseball as we know it probably began in the 1840s or early 1850s. Initially, it was probably more popular in urban areas rather than rural communities, given that the population density could support multiple teams in a given geographic area. That doesn't mean that baseball wasn't popular in rural areas as well, but the Civil War put a crimp in the development of the game as young and middle-aged men answered the call to arms. But the game followed the men to war, as soldiers, Confederate and Union alike, played baseball to pass the time in the dreary camps in which they lived. Prisoners of war also played the game for similar reasons. Kewaneean J.S. Minor, who spent time in the infamous Andersonville Confederate prison and saw upwards of 30,000 men pass through, with starvation rations and 200 men a day dying, recalled the game being played by the prisoners to distract them from the horrors they faced. Baseball was likely introduced into Kewanee not long after its founding, but certainly by the early 1860s, as Kewanee grew rapidly and connected in commerce with Chicago, Bloomington, and other cities in which the game was played. As with the rest of the country, the game followed the soldiers home after the war and gained in popularity. In 1867, the Baseball Club of Kewanee sent 2 men to Chicago to help form an Illinois association affiliated with the National Association of Baseball Players. One of them, O.D. Bassett, was the son of Kewanee newspaperman Chauncey Bassett, considered the father of the Kewanee Press. The Illinois group represented 55 clubs, including the Kewanee Club. Soon, games were being played by the Kewanee Blue Stockings against teams from Princeton, from Stark County, from Galesburg, Altoona, and other area cities. They were played on the road, at home, and soon the Blue Stockings were the Henry County baseball champions. John P. Brady, famous Kewanee businessman, sportsman, and all-round raconteur, recalled as a kid in the mid-1870s the locations of some of the baseball grounds. There was the old grounds, a lot on 5th Street east of the Anderson Steam Heater / Haxton Steam Heater plant, which later grew into Walworth. He recalled that the batter faced north, which made it a very short field to the railroad tracks. There was also a field in Rockwell's pasture, a little north and west of the future site of St. Francis Hospital, probably bounded by today's Prospect, Rockwell, and Beach Streets. They also played ball on the Wethersfield Commons. Here's probably the earliest photo of a Kewanee baseball team, all decked out in their cool uniforms and with a mascot, their Bat Boy. Brady recalled that by the 1880s, the better teams played on the North Main grounds, west of the intersection of Main and 10th Streets. There was a small amphitheater there, and the field was partially fenced. According to Brady, the Haxton Steam Heater Club played on this grounds, and it was a site of some real baseball, as the Heater Club was made up mostly of players who worked in the shops and occasionally outside talent. Brady recalled that the team would practice on Sundays, and during the week, they'd take batting practice to the west of the old City Hall on the corner of today's 3rd and Tremont Streets, hitting toward the old freight terminal to the west, north of the intersection of today's Chestnut and 3rd Streets. He said, "The sidelines would be filled with people watching the players who kept going until it was too dark to see the ball." Brady recalled that on the North Main grounds, the Haxtons played the Chicago White Stockings in 1885. The White Stockings were a talented professional team and the predecessor to the Chicago Cubs. The game drew the largest crowd to witness a baseball game in Kewanee at that time, around 2,000 fans. Cap Anson's White Stockings won the 1-hour, 26-minute game 12-1. Anson was a fine ball player, but a virulent racist, and he was instrumental in driving black Americans out of the game. A young Billy Sunday played for the White Stockings long before his preaching days. 20 years later, Billy Sunday preached in Kewanee for a week at the then new Armory building. He drew thousands each night during his stay. I intentionally said earlier that Cap Anson helped to drive black Americans out of baseball because there were black Americans playing professional ball in the 1880s. In 1884, Moses Fleetwood Walker, nicknamed Fleets, arguably became the first black American to play professionally in Major League Baseball, 63 years before Jackie Robinson and the reintegration of MLB. He was a catcher on the Oberlin College team, and then he went to the University of Michigan to read law, and he played for that team as well. In 1884, he played for the Toledo franchise in the American Association, considered the first professional baseball league. But he and other black Americans suffered from indignities and, at times, vicious practices intended to drive them out of the game. For instance, Frank Grant, one of the best second basemen of his era, playing with Buffalo in the International League, had to wear homemade wooden shin guards to protect his legs from the hard-sliding white runners kicking their spikes at his body. Ultimately, black Americans were driven out of Major League Baseball by the viciousness and Jim Crow racism. This was the state of baseball when Lou Reynolds arrived in Kewanee. There were few, if any, black Americans in Kewanee before the Civil War, few, if any, in all of Henry County. But during and after the war, those formerly enslaved Americans found their way north. Many were brought along by Union officers returning home. For instance, in May 1862, Captain Hamilton M. Way, a well-known and respected Kewaneean, resigned from his commission, likely due to either injury or, more likely, the severe dysentery running rampant through both sides in and around where he fought. On his journey back home to Kewanee, Way took with him 25 formerly enslaved persons on the promise of a new life. Included in that group were longtime Kewaneeans Frank Lewis and George Washington. After arriving in Kewanee, a number of those black Americans turned around and enlisted in the Union Army, serving in various units in the U.S. Colored Army. They included Frank Lewis, George Bolden, Archibald Hobson, Oliver Ward, Newton Sullivan, and Richard Carroll, whose muster-in record is shown here. By the 1870 census, Kewanee's black American numbers were hovering around 40 residents. They were working primarily in the service industries and later in the larger coal mines north of the city, and they lived in and around Kewanee's white Americans. Unlike cities not too far to their south, such as Macomb, which were populated by whites from the southern states who lived with enslavement, Kewanee was founded by Eastern abolitionists who took a strong stance against slavery before the war and a charitable posture toward former slaves after the war. Soon Kewanee's black Americans were participating in civic and other activities in Kewanee, including starting an African Methodist Episcopal congregation. The black American population continued to hover around 40 or so citizens for the next couple of decades. This was the racial makeup of Kewanee Lou Reynolds found when he arrived. Lewis Thomas Reynolds was likely born in Frankfort, Missouri in 1872, 7 years after the Civil War ended. Lou and his family found themselves in Abington, Illinois. It was in Abington where Lou began playing baseball at the age of 15. Lou soon found himself playing left field for the Heading College team. He also joined the Abington Globe Overhaul Company team, pitching and playing first base, the latter position one he would play for most of the rest of his baseball career. It also appears that Lou played with the Galesburg Pavers in the Illinois-Iowa League. Until 1892, Lou played around Abington and Galesburg with a variety of teams. He then found his way to Kewanee. How did Lou Reynolds end up in Kewanee? Family in baseball, just not sure of the order. He was 22 years old. Lou's older sister Lucinda and her family lived in Kewanee. Lucinda had married Emmanuel Bailey in 1869 in Kewanee and soon began raising a family. By the time Lou moved to Kewanee, Emmanuel had died and Lucinda was raising her family alone. Lucinda and her family were living at 212 Cutters Avenue, today's Elliott Street. When Lou arrived in Kewanee, he boarded with Lucinda and her family. After his arrival, Lou began working as a stable worker, probably at Guest's Wagon Shop. Lou was the uncle of Lucinda's son, Walter T. Bailey, who was the first Black American to graduate from the University of Illinois School of Architecture, and later became an accomplished architect and educator at the Tuskegee Institute. Lou likely became a father figure to Lucinda's children, and Walter T. Bailey, as we know, became active in sports at Kewanee High School, so he likely received encouragement from Lou and assistance along the way. But there's another story of why Lou Reynolds ended up in Kewanee. Before Lou arrived, one of the up-and-coming area teams was the Kewanee Shamrocks. The Shamrock team was run by John Patrick Brady, who also played shortstop. Brady's father, Thomas, owned a saloon on 3rd Street at the intersection of Chestnut. But in the early 1890s, he built a palatial saloon funded in part by Pabst Brewing Company, today's Cerno's. When Thomas died, John P. Brady took over Brady's saloon. According to John Brady, Brady was the reason Lou came to Kewanee. In Brady's story, he was in Galesburg for an Emancipation Day celebration. Emancipation Day was celebrated by Black Americans after the Civil War. On September 22, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation threatening to free all enslaved people in the states in rebellion if those states did not return to the Union by January 1, 1863. In Brady's story, he watched a baseball game that day. It was a game between Galesburg and an Abington team. Near the end of the game, Lou smacked a long one over the fence to break up a pitcher's duel. Brady claimed that he immediately convinced Lou to come to Kewanee to play with his team. Upon Lou's arrival in Kewanee, he joined the Shamrocks. Lou quickly became a star of the team. He hit for power, stole bases, and played a fine first base. For the next 3 years, he helped the Shamrocks become a baseball force in the area. But in 1897, Lou had the opportunity to move up in the baseball world. He was 25 years old. Lou's skills were noticed by W.S. Peters, owner and manager of the Chicago Union's professional ball team. The Unions began as a prairie team in the early 1880s, but by the middle of the 1890s, Chicago's Inner Ocean newspaper pronounced that the Unions stands today as the foremost colored organization of its kind in the world. During the week, the team toured small towns throughout the Midwest, playing white and black American teams, and then playing Sunday home games in the Windy City at its Union Park grounds at 37th and Butler Streets, just north of the stockyards. In January 1897, Peters signed Lou not just to play first base for his team, but also to serve as its captain. The season began in March and stretched into October before moving indoors. The Unions were soon deemed the color champions of the West, and they played Eastern Championship teams over the month of June, including New York's Cuban X-Giants and New York's Cuban Giants. From March to September, the Unions barnstormed the Midwest during the week while playing Sundays at its home park for its bigger gate receipts. By the end of the year, the team had played 150 games and lost only 23. Lou played in only 40 of those games. Likely he was working in Kewanee during the week and then going to Chicago on the weekend to play with the Unions. But he led the team in batting with an average of over 400. At season's end, Lou returned to Kewanee where he drove a hack for William Duggar. While there, he was contemplating his options for the next year, which included an offer to play again for the Unions, to switch to the Page Fence Giants, or to the Cuban Giants, or he could join a new team expected to be organized by Chicago's Siegel Cooper Company department store, whose New York store, when opened in 1896, was the largest department store in the world. I couldn't find any records of Lou playing in Chicago in 1898. He likely did, but he played local ball in and around Kewanee as well. Unfortunately, Lou, like other black Americans, had to fend off racial taunts regularly, in this case while on the road. In the ball game at Cambridge Thursday, some young men had the ill breeding to insult Lewis Reynolds because he was a colored man. As long as Mr. Reynolds acted the gentleman, which he did, he should have been accorded gentlemanly treatment. Lou received the support of his teammates as well as his hometown newspaper. In February 1899, Lou set up a bootblacking chair at the Kewanee house, where he also served as a porter and where he lived. But later in the year, he played ball again in Chicago with a number of the Black American teams. There is no record of Lou having played in Chicago after the 1899 season, but he returned to Kewanee and he played for John Brady's Kewanee Regulars at the new Crystal Lake field adjacent to the new lake, park, and recreational facility Brady had built. Lou was 29 years old. Brady had leased the land which became Crystal Lake Park, located on the west side of Water Street, now Madison Street. It had been formed as a result of the water treatment plant. The lake was on the north side of the second hole of today's Baker Park golf course. Brady converted the land into a resort with boating, bathing, shoot-the-chutes, and picnic grounds. There was also a dance pavilion. The park also had a baseball field located to the west on Cambridge Road on what is now most of the rest of the front nine of today's golf course. At the time, Brady also became manager of one of the best amateur baseball teams in Kewanee, the Kewanee Regulars. Later, as a streetcar system was being put into place, Terminal Park was built at the location of the old East Lake Park site. A ball field was built, and the fences and other accoutrements from Crystal Lake were moved there. They also played some games at a field at the fairgrounds east of town. Here are some photos of fans at the Terminal Park baseball field watching a game. And Lou continued to shine for the Regulars. In this article, they're talking about Lou leading the team in hitting with an average of .391. They were also discussing some of his exploits over his career, including the fact that over the last 17 years he had never hit below .300. It talked about a game between Kewanee and Woodhull where Lou hit 3 home runs. It talked about a game in Chicago when Lou was playing against the well-known pitcher Jot Gore. He got 4 hits that day and winning the game in the 9th inning with a home run. And Lou continued to play a high quality of baseball. In this 1906 clipping, Lou made his debut, hitting 2 doubles in his first game back. In this photo showing the 1907 Kewanee Regulars, Lou is 35 years old. You can look at the faces of the other men and know that Lou was by far the oldest man playing on the team. In 1908, Lou was 36 years old and took on coaching duties for the Kewanee Regulars while he continued to play for them. In 1914, Lou was still playing ball at the age of 42, playing again for the Regulars. In this 1915 clipping, Lou was playing for the Galesburg Giants against the Kewanee Eagles. At 43 years of age, he was still playing baseball. When Lou was not playing baseball, he was involved in other aspects of the sport, an ambassador for the game. Here we see him umpiring a church league game in 1910. He umpired in and around Kewanee. He also coached youth and high school teams, and not just in baseball, in football and track as well. In 1913, he organized a Black American baseball team, and he managed the team. Even as Lou stopped playing regularly, he came back to play in old-timers games. He was 52 years old when he played in the 1924. And Lou was 72 years old when he played in this 1944 5-inning old-timers game. Over the years, Lou kept in touch with Black Americans he played with in Chicago in the old days. Here, Jim Candy Taylor and Lou were shaking hands before a game where Candy's Chicago American Giants were playing a Kewanee team at Northeast Park in 1947. Lou was a hard worker and he was well respected in Kewanee. He had a variety of jobs throughout his life in Kewanee. He started as a stable hand. He drove hacks. He operated a bootblacking chair and was a porter at the Kewanee house. He later became a custodian at various Kewanee schools and businesses. Then around 1915, he became steward at the Elks Club, a position of responsibility he held for a number of years. Toward the end of his working years, Lou did utility work at the home of B.F. Baker, former Kewanee mayor. Lou was active in the community as well. He was active in the Bethel AME Church, where he was a trustee, as well as leader of various groups. Here, the Boy Scouts. He organized and ran programs for the Elks Club, and he took part in a myriad of other civic activities. Lou's only son was Charles Williams Reynolds, born around 1887 in Abingdon. Charles' mom was Hattie Thomas, but we don't know whether Lou and Hattie ever were married. Charles was about 5 or 6 when Lou went to Kewanee. If Lou and Hattie were married, it would seem that Hattie and Charles would have accompanied Lou to Kewanee, or at least joined him later. We do know that Lou regularly returned to Abingdon to visit Charles. In 1903, when Lou was 31 years old, he married Mrs. Emma Hamilton, a widow who had 5 children with her first husband. We don't know whether any were still living with her at the time of the marriage. In the announcement, the paper wrote that the groom is well known in Kewanee, having resided here for the last 10 years, and his reputation as a fast baseball player is by no means confined to this locality. He is well thought of here. By the end of the decade, Lou and Emma moved into their home at 601 O'Day Street, just north of the tracks, where Lou would live for the rest of his life. Tragedy struck in 1928 when Emma died. She had been a longtime member of the AME Church. In 1929, at age 57, Lou married Mamie Beck of Chicago. They soon were residing again in Lou's home on O'Day Street. Mamie died in 1945. At age 73, Lou was alone again. Lou's only son, Charles Williams Reynolds, died in 1947. Charles and his family were living in Galesburg, but he had been admitted to the Kewanee Public Hospital when he died. Lou and his good friend Sam Culver accompanied the remains to Galesburg for the funeral. In April 1948, Lou married Willie Riggs of East St. Louis. They were married in Little Rock, Arkansas, but returned to Kewanee, to Lou's home on O'Day Street. How did Lou play the game? One word: seriously. John P. Brady told of when Kewanee played Peoria Woodhull. Brady had scheduled a morning and an afternoon game in order to be able to charge 2 gates. But Woodhull was a particularly bad team, and Brady was afraid that if Kewanee beat them badly, the fans would not return for the afternoon game. So Brady tried to make the game close. Here's what he said: "I was playing short and Lou was on first. I got one and tried to overthrow first. I got it high. He sure went up in the air after that ball and got it. He knew what I had in mind and he hollered for me to get a boy and put on that arm, and then he laughed. I tried it once more and did not make it. And to make matters worse, he had 3 home runs in that morning game, but it kept the crowd at home for the afternoon game." What about Lou's character? Brady again tells a story. The Kewanee team had an away game. They arrived in the town where they would play and sat down for a late afternoon dinner. Here's what Brady said: "We were all seated and they wouldn't let Lou eat in the dining room, and all the fellows got up and went out. But Lou insisted that they eat there, and the guys finally went back in, and the management of the hotel fixed up a private dining room for Lou in appreciation of what he had done." Finally, what was Lou like as a man? Once again, here is John Brady. Lou was a wonderful character, and I have never seen him mad. While he was always able to take care of himself, he was always for the underdog. I had known him for 60 years, and I had never heard him use an oath or take a drink, and that is something for a fellow that would follow that profession. Louis Thomas Reynolds died on Christmas Day in 1948. He had been preceded in death by his parents, his only son, and 2 wives. He was survived by his 3rd wife. We don't know what happened to Charlie's mom, Hattie Thomas. When Lou Reynolds died nearly 50 years after his arrival in Kewanee, he was the acknowledged grand old man of baseball in Kewanee, Kewanee's Mr. Baseball. Born to enslaved parents, Lou won the respect of the city of Kewanee over his lifetime. It was a respect not just based on the exceptional quality of his baseball skills, but on the exceptional quality of Lou as a man. My article, Lou Reynolds, the Grand Old Man of Baseball in Kewanee, Illinois, will appear this fall in the Illinois Heritage Magazine, published by the Illinois State Historical Society. It's timed to coincide with the Negro League Baseball exhibit being presented at the Springfield and Central Illinois African American History Museum, which runs from September 4th through October 30th.